All right, let's dive in. Number 10. Lip plates, the ornament that quietly rebuilt a jaw. In the lowlands of the Omo Valley in southern Ethiopia, a teenage girl sits still while an older woman pierces her lower lip with a sharp blade. A small wooden peg goes in to keep the wound open.
Over the following months, that peg is swapped for larger ones, and eventually for a flat disc of clay or wood,
Until the lip can hold a plate as wide as a coffee cup. Among the Mercy and Surma peoples, this has long marked a young woman's passage toward marriage. The plate is the part everyone notices. The lasting change sits underneath it, in territory the eye never reaches. To seat a disc that size, the lower front teeth are usually extracted, and that single act sets off a slow chain reaction in the bone. Teeth are not just decoration anchored in the gum. The roots transmit pressure into the jaw every time a person bites or chews. And that pressure is the signal that tells the surrounding bone to stay dense and stay present. Remove the teeth and the signal stops.
the bone of the lower jaw along the front, deprived of its old job, gradually thins and recedes.
This process, called alveolar resorption, is the same one dentists watch for in anyone who loses teeth and never replaces them. What makes the lip plate striking is that the loss is invited, planned, and read as beautiful. The stretched lip never recoils to its original shape either. Skin pushed steadily outward for years loses the elasticity that would let it spring back. So a woman who has worn a large plate carries that long, looping lower lip whether the disc is in place or set aside for the night. Anthropologists who have lived among Omo Valley communities describe the plate as a statement of identity and belonging far more than a simple cosmetic choice. Something closer to a visible biography worn on the face. There is a quieter detail that tends to get lost in the dramatic photographs. The size a woman's plate reaches is, in many cases, her own decision rather than a fixed rule. And some choose to stop early or not to stretch at all. The practice has also been shifting under outside pressure, tourism, and changing ideas within the communities themselves, so that what looks timeless in a photograph is in fact a living tradition that bends with each generation. Still, the body keeps its own record, regardless of the choices around it. Long after a plate is removed for the last time, the gap in the dental row remains. The thinned ridge of jawbone stays thinned, and the lip holds its stretched arc. A practice meant to announce beauty and maturity ends up authoring a permanent change in the architecture of the lower face, written first in soft tissue and then slowly into bone that will never be asked to chew against those missing teeth again. Number 9. Ear stretching, when the ornament becomes its own sculptor. Picture an earlobe with an opening wide enough to pass a thumb through, the rim of skin thinned to a soft loop that swings when the head turns. This is not a piercing in any ordinary sense. It is the slow, deliberate enlarging of a hole over months or years, using plugs, spools, and discs of steadily increasing size. And people on nearly every continent have done it, from communities in East Africa to groups across Southeast Asia and the ancient cultures of Mesoamerica. The mechanism is gradual stretching, and the body cooperates up to a point. Skin and the soft tissue of the lobe can expand when pressure is applied slowly enough, because living tissue responds to steady tension by growing to accommodate it. The same broad principle surgeons rely on with tissue expanders. Go slowly, and the lobe widens while staying intact. Push too fast or hang too much weight, and the tissue thins past the point of recovery. Beyond a certain diameter, often cited by modern practitioners as somewhere around the size of a small coin, the lobe loses its ability to shrink back if the jewelry is ever removed. The hole becomes permanent. The detail that surprises people is where the heaviest consequences land, and it is not the hole itself. It is gravity. Ornaments worn day and night for decades drag downward without pause, and that constant load stretches the lobe far below its natural position, sometimes until the loop of skin reaches the jawline or lower. Heavy ear ornaments have been documented widely, and in some cases, the pull has been severe enough that the thinned band of tissue tears under its own burden, leaving a split lobe that becomes its own marker of a life spent wearing weight. There is a common claim that stretched lobes reshape the skull itself, and here the truth is narrower than the legend. The dramatic, lasting changes sit in the soft tissue, the lobe, the canal of skin, the surrounding flesh, rather than in the temporal bone of the skull. What the practice does leave in the skeletal and archaeological record is more indirect. Burials are sometimes identified by the large ear ornaments resting exactly where the lobes once held them, and the size of those objects tells researchers how far the tissue must have been stretched to carry them. The ornament outlasts the ear and testifies on its behalf. You can recognize a lifelong wearer even with every plug and ring removed. The lobe hangs long and thin. The opening gapes instead of closing, and the lower edge of the ear has been redrawn into a shape no unstretched ear ever takes. The jewelry did the work, but the true sculptor was its own weight, pressing the same direction every hour of every year, until the body simply gave the shape that the pull demanded. Number 8. Cranial binding. The skull shaped by human hands. Pull an elongated skull from a museum drawer and the proportions seem impossible. The cranium climbs backward into a long, tapering vault, the forehead sloping away at an angle no ordinary head ever takes. Skulls like these have surfaced from Peru, from Central Asia, from parts of Africa and Europe, and for a long time the strangest explanations were the most popular ones, from lost races to visitors from elsewhere. The real answer is both simpler and more unsettling. Ordinary parents did this to their own newborns, on purpose, generation after generation. The biology that makes it possible is the same fragility that protects every human infant. A baby's skull arrives unfinished, built from separate plates joined by soft seams and gaps called fontanelles, the spots that let the head compress during birth and then expand as the brain grows. Those plates stay pliable for the first months and years of life. Bind the head during that window, and the growing skull conforms to whatever steady pressure surrounds it. Two broad methods recur across the world. One uses pads of cloth wrapped tightly around the head. The other clamps the skull between two boards, often a cradle board against the back, and a second board across the forehead, producing the dramatic, flattened and elongated profile. The crucial point, confirmed by modern imaging of these skulls, is that the practice changed the shape of the brain case without reliably shrinking its internal volume. The brain still grew. It simply grew into the mold the binding allowed, redistributed rather than reduced, which is why populations that practiced head shaping over centuries showed no broad pattern of impaired ability. The body found room for the same organ in a redesigned container. What turns this from curiosity into something stranger is how widespread it was. Communities separated by oceans and thousands of years, with no contact and no shared instruction, independently arrived at the idea of remodeling an infant's head as a mark of beauty, status, or belonging to a particular group. In some societies, the shape announced your community at a glance, a permanent badge applied before you could speak or consent. A person carried it through every stage of life, in front of every stranger, never able to set it aside the way one removes an ornament at night. There is a tender contradiction folded into the method. The binding was usually done by mothers and close kin, with care rather than cruelty. The cloths adjusted gently over weeks while the infant was fed and held. The pressure had to be light enough to spare the child and persistent enough to redirect bone, a balance learned and passed down by hand. The hands that reshaped the skull were the same hands that comforted the child wearing it. The result is one of the clearest cases anywhere of a beauty ideal written directly into the human frame before its owner had any say. A wrapped head becomes a permanently reshaped one, and the angle of that forehead, set in the first years of life, holds its line for as long as the skull exists, long after the cloth and boards have crumbled into nothing. Number 7. Neck rings. The truth the photographs hide. The popular story is everywhere. Women of the Kayan, a group within the broader Karenni people whose communities span parts of Myanmar and Thailand, wear stacked brass coils around their necks, and the coils are said to stretch the neck into the elongated shape that earned them the tourist nickname of giraffe women. Lift the coils, the story warns, and the neck will flop because the muscles have wasted away. Almost none of that holds up once you look at what is actually happening inside the body. The neck is not being lengthened at all. The human cervical spine has 7 vertebrae, and no amount of brass adds a single one or pulls the existing bones apart into a longer column. X-ray studies of women who wear the coils have shown that the vertebrae stay in their normal number and arrangement. The illusion of a swan-like neck comes from somewhere lower, and that is where the real deformation lives. The coils are heavy, and their weight bears down constantly on the shoulders. Over years, that downward load presses the collarbones and the upper ribs lower than their natural resting position, rotating the whole shoulder girdle downward and away from the chin. The neck appears to grow because everything beneath it has been pushed down, creating extra visible distance between the jaw and the shoulders. The change is real and lasting, but it is a deformation of the shoulder region, masquerading as a longer neck. The claim about a fatal floppy neck deserves the same scrutiny, and it mostly dissolves under it. The neck muscles do not simply vanish, and women have removed their coils for cleaning, for medical care, for personal choice, without their heads collapsing. What can happen after decades of wear is bruised or weakened skin and some discomfort once the support is gone, along with a neck that looks strange and unsupported to its owner because the shoulders sit so low. The drama of the legend outruns the anatomy by a wide margin. The reasons women take up the coils are layered and have shifted across time. The practice has carried meanings of ethnic identity, beauty, and belonging. And in recent decades, it became entangled with tourism in ways that pulled it in new directions, with some young women keeping the tradition for visitors and others setting it aside entirely. The body in the middle of all this absorbs the consequences, regardless of which reason brought the brass to the neck. What lingers is the gap between what a casual observer sees and what the skeleton records. Outsiders look at the coils and imagine a stretched neck, a delicate, exotic transformation. The bones tell a blunter story of a shoulder girdle pressed downward under steady weight, holding that lowered shape long after the last coil is unwound and the brass set aside. Number 6. Tooth filing and jade inlays, jewelry that grew into the body. A jade-studded tooth sounds like a modern dental fashion, the kind of thing that surfaces in celebrity profiles. The ancient Maya were doing a version of it more than 1,000 years ago, drilling neat round holes into the front faces of living teeth and cementing in small discs of jadeite, pyrite, and other polished stones. Across Mesoamerica, people also filed their teeth into points, notches, and elaborate patterns, reshaping the smile into a deliberate work of design. Look at how precise the work was, and the skill becomes the real surprise. The inlays sit in cavities cut into the enamel, the hardest substance the human body produces, bored out with a tubular drill, very likely spun with the help of an abrasive grit and water. The holes had to be deep enough to seat the stone, and shallow enough to avoid breaching the sensitive pulp at the tooth's core. Many surviving teeth show inlays still cemented in place after a millennium in the ground, held by a mineral adhesive whose exact recipes are still studied. The ancient operators clearly understood the structure of a tooth well enough to stop just short of killing it. The filing and drilling were performed on permanent adult teeth, the ones a person keeps for life, which means every alteration was final from the moment it was made. Enamel does not regrow. Once a tooth was ground into a point or pierced for a stone, that shape was carried to the grave, and indeed into the archaeological record, where these modified teeth are among the most recognizable signatures of the people who bore them. The decoration outlived the person and announced them across centuries. The motives sat closer to identity and status than to anything we would call simple vanity. Patterns of dental modification could signal one's community, rank, or role, and the practice appears across different social levels rather than being locked to elites alone. The body itself became the display case for these meanings, with the message cut permanently into the most visible bones a person owns, the teeth that show with every word and every smile. There is a sharp irony buried in the procedure. Done carefully, these alterations could spare the pulp and leave the tooth alive and functional, a piece of jewelry that the body kept nourished with its own blood supply. Done carelessly, the same drilling risked opening the pulp to infection, turning an ornament into a source of pain and disease. The line between a dazzling, decorated smile and a slow dental catastrophe ran through a few fragile millimeters of enamel, and the ancient hands that did this work walked that line by feel, with no anesthetic to dull what the patient was enduring in the chair. Number 5. Tooth ablation. The gap that rebuilt the jaw. A skeleton turns up with its front teeth missing, and the first guess is almost always violence or decay. Then the jaw is examined closely, and the story falls apart. The bone where the teeth once sat has healed over smoothly, sealed and remodeled, the unmistakable sign that the teeth were gone for years before death. These were healthy teeth, removed deliberately while the person lived, and the practice of knocking them out on purpose shows up in the human record across an astonishing range of places, from prehistoric Japan to parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, and beyond. The procedure targeted sound, functional teeth, usually in the front of the mouth where the loss would be most visible. Tooth ablation, as researchers call it, was carried out without anesthetic, the tooth levered or struck out of its socket, leaving an open wound in the gum and bone. In the prehistoric Jomon culture of Japan, patterned removal of specific front teeth has been documented widely enough that scholars read it as a marker tied to life stages and group membership, a rite that altered the face at a defined moment of a person's life. The lasting evidence sits in the bone itself, and this is the part that makes ablation so legible thousands of years later. When a tooth is lost, the socket that held it no longer has a root to support, and the body resorbs that now purposeless bone, filling and flattening the ridge of the jaw where the tooth used to stand. A gap left by a recent injury looks raw and open. A gap from ablation done long ago looks healed and remodeled, the jawline quietly rebuilt around the absence. Osteologists can tell the difference at a glance, which is how an intentional cultural act gets separated from an accident or a brawl. The reasons people did this were rarely about appearance alone in any shallow sense. Removing the teeth could mark the passage into adulthood, signal mourning for a relative, denote marital status, or identify someone as belonging to a particular community, with the exact meaning varying enormously from one culture to the next. A young person might submit to the ritual at a set age, the loss announcing to everyone around them that they had crossed a threshold and could never cross back. The face became a public document of where someone stood in the order of their society. The everyday cost rode along with the symbolism. Front teeth do real work, biting, shaping sounds, holding the structure of the mouth, and their permanent absence changed how a person ate and spoke for the rest of their life. Every meal and every word carried a small reminder of the day the teeth were taken, a sacrifice made once and then lived with quietly, day after day, for as long as the person drew breath. Number 4. Corsetry, the cage that bent the ribs. The Victorian corset has spent more than a century at the center of an argument. One side insists it crushed organs, snapped ribs, and even removed them, turning women into fainting invalids for the sake of a tiny waist. The other side waves all of it away as exaggeration invented by reformers and modern mythmakers. The skeletons settle the dispute, and they side with neither extreme. Tight lacing did not routinely break ribs or excise them, but it absolutely reshaped the living skeleton in ways that survive in the bone to this day. Examinations of female skeletons from the corset-wearing centuries have turned up rib cages distorted in a consistent, telltale pattern. The lower ribs, the floating ribs that are least anchored, were pushed inward and angled downward, their normal outward curve reversed by years of constant inward pressure. In some specimens, the ribs press so close to the spine that the change is obvious at a glance. The breastbone and the spine itself could be subtly affected as the whole thorax was squeezed into the fashionable silhouette. The mechanism is the same principle that shapes any growing or remodeling bone. Apply steady, gentle force over a long enough span, and bone, a living tissue constantly rebuilt throughout life, gradually accommodates the pressure. A corset worn daily from girlhood into adulthood delivered exactly that. Hours of inward compression every single day for years on end, slowly persuading the rib cage to hold a shape it was never built to hold. The garment came off at night, but the skeleton kept a running average of all those laced hours. The lurid claims need trimming back to the truth. There is no good evidence that women commonly had ribs surgically removed to achieve a smaller waist, a story that persists with almost no documented cases behind it. Genuine extreme tight lacing was less universal than the caricature suggests, with many women wearing their stays at moderate tension for support, rather than for a dramatic hourglass. The real harms were quieter and more pervasive: restricted breathing capacity, displaced organs that shifted to make room, weakened back and abdominal muscles that had leaned on the corset to do their work. The cost outlived the fashion in the most literal way possible. A woman who laced tightly for decades carried a permanently altered ribcage into old age and into her grave. The curve of fashion fixed into her bones long after the silk and whalebone had rotted away. Run a hand along one of those reshaped lower ribs in a museum collection, and the inward bend is unmistakable under the fingers, a fashion trend that left its signature on the very scaffolding of the body, readable centuries after the last lace was loosened. Number 3. The sculpted face, when the cradle redesigned the profile. A newborn skull is one of the strangest objects in human anatomy, and most people never stop to consider why. It arrives not as a single solid dome, but as separate plates of bone, soft and flexible, connected by membranes and gaps that have not yet closed. The famous soft spots on an infant's head are simply the largest of these openings. This unfinished quality exists for a brutally practical reason, allowing the skull to compress and overlap as it passes through the birth canal, and it leaves the head astonishingly malleable for months and even years after birth. Several cultures across history looked at that softness and saw an opportunity, and among the Maya, the shaping of a child's head and face became a deliberate art. The practice belongs to the broad family of intentional cranial modification, but the Maya pursued it with particular sophistication and clear aesthetic goals tied to the look of the whole face. Across many Maya communities, infants had their heads bound or pressed using cradle boards, padded boards, and bindings applied in the first months of life, when the bone was at its most yielding. Two broad styles dominate the archaeological record. One flattened the head front to back, producing a tall, upswept skull. The other, achieved with a freer style of binding, lengthened the head into a more rounded, elongated form. The pressure was not confined to the back of the skull. It influenced the slope of the forehead and, through that, the apparent line of the brow and nose, sculpting the entire profile toward an admired ideal that art of the period reflects again and again. The science behind how this works is well understood, and leaves no room for doubt that the changes were permanent. Bone is a living tissue that grows and remodels in response to the forces placed on it, and an infant skull responds to sustained, gentle pressure by altering the direction of its growth. A board held against the forehead day after day does not crush the brain inside. The brain case simply expands in the directions left open to it, redistributing its volume rather than losing it. The result is a skull of normal capacity, bent into an abnormal shape, with the forehead made to recede or rise, and the overall contour fixed into the deliberately engineered form. Once the sutures between the plates fused and growth completed, that shape was locked for life. No later treatment could undo it, which is precisely why these modified skulls remain so vividly recognizable in collections today, their reshaped foreheads and sweeping profiles instantly setting them apart from unmodified heads. The reasons the Maya did this run deep into how they understood the body and the cosmos. The head shape carried meaning connected to identity, to social standing, and to ideals expressed in their religious imagery, where elongated heads and sloping foreheads appear on depictions of revered figures. Shaping a child's head was a way of marking that child as a proper member of the community, and of bringing the living face into harmony with a cultural vision of beauty and rightness. The work began in earliest infancy, decided entirely by parents and elders, the child far too young to have any say in the form their face would carry for the rest of their existence. A practice meant as care and belonging was also an irreversible decision imposed before the person could understand it. There is a strange tenderness threaded through the brutality of it. The binding was done by families to their own infants, in the cradle, as an act of love and inclusion rather than cruelty. The same hands that fed and soothed the child, also molding its skull toward the shape the culture prized. The boards were padded, the pressure gradual, the intent protective in its own logic. Run a fingertip along the receding forehead of one of these skulls, and the deliberate flatness is unmistakable. A smooth plane where a rounded brow should sit, shaped by a parent who believed they were giving their child the gift of a beautiful and proper face. The question that lingers is one we still have not fully answered. Modern study finds no evidence that this reshaping damaged intelligence or harmed the brain, which raises an uncomfortable thought about how completely the human form can be redesigned without obvious cost. An entire society agreed on what a beautiful head looked like, and then it reached into the cradle and built that beauty into the bone of its children, generation after generation, leaving behind skulls that still wear the exact proportions their parents chose for them centuries before any of us were born. Number 2. Foot binding, the break that became a lotus. A girl of perhaps 5 sits while her mother takes hold of her foot and bends 4 of the toes down hard against the sole. The toes do not fold that way on their own. They have to be forced until the small bones give, and then a long strip of cloth is wound around the foot to drive the broken toes against the heel and hold them there. In the months that follow, the arch itself is bent upward until it too breaks, drawing the toes and the heel closer together until the foot folds nearly in half. This was inflicted on countless girls across much of China for roughly 1,000 years, and the prize at the end of all that breaking was a foot small enough to fit the ideal, called the golden lotus. A foot of perhaps 10 centimeters or even less, treated as the supreme mark of feminine beauty, refinement, and worth. The skeletal evidence for what binding did to the human body is stark and entirely unambiguous, written into the bones of women who lived and died with bound feet. Examinations of these remains show foot bones crushed, fractured, and fused into shapes no natural foot ever assumes. The toes collapse beneath the sole, the arch forced into an extreme curve, the whole structure shortened and folded into a compact knot of bone. The damage never confined itself to the feet. Studies of older women who had been bound in childhood found consequences reaching far higher up the body, with reduced bone density and an altered way of walking that raised the risk of falls. And those falls in turn broke hips and vertebrae in people whose balance had been compromised since girlhood. A foot that cannot function normally rewrites how a person stands, shifts their weight, and carries themselves through every step of every remaining year of life. The mechanism set this practice apart from almost everything else in this countdown, because it was not a single act of shaping, but a years-long campaign of controlled destruction.
The binding was repeated again and again. The cloth unwound, the foot washed, the toenails trimmed back to stop them cutting into the folded flesh, and then the wrappings drawn tighter than the time before. A sweetish odor of decay often seeped from beneath the bindings, since tissue died where the bandages choked off the blood supply, and infection lurked as a constant threat that sometimes turned fatal. Toes were known to ulcerate and fall away entirely, and that loss was quietly welcomed rather than mourned, because a foot with fewer toes could be bound smaller still. Pain walked beside the girl throughout, sharpest in the first year or two and never wholly absent afterward, as she relearned how to stand and move on a foot that had been deliberately ruined for the sake of how it would look inside a shoe. The reasons this endured for 10 centuries reached down into the deepest structures of the society that practiced it. Bound feet were tied to marriageability, to family status, and to the prevailing idea of a woman's virtue, discipline, and desirability, so that a daughter with properly bound feet was understood to hold far stronger prospects for an advantageous marriage. The practice moved across class lines in complicated ways, embraced by elite households and aspired to by poorer families hoping to lift their daughters' fortunes, until it became so deeply fused with the very definition of femininity that mothers inflicted it on their daughters precisely because they loved them and wanted to secure their place in the world. The tiny embroidered shoes made for these feet were objects of genuine pride and delicate craftsmanship, beautiful silk coverings stitched to fit what lay crushed and folded within.
Across generation after generation, women who had survived the breaking turned and passed it on to the girls in their care, the suffering handed down through the very bond that was meant to shelter them. The practice did finally collapse, suppressed by reform movements and outright bans across the early 20th century, and the last women to undergo it as children lived on into recent decades, a few still alive within living memory, their folded feet concealed inside specially made shoes. The shoes themselves survive in museum cases and family chests, astonishingly small, the silk and leather molded around a form that could only ever be achieved by breaking a child's living bones. Set one of those shoes against an adult human hand and it disappears into the palm, telling the entire story without a single word. The architecture beneath the embroidery rebuilt by force in pursuit of a flower that bloomed nowhere outside the imagination of those who demanded it. The most disquieting part is how completely a society convinced itself that the deliberate destruction of one of evolution's most elegant structures was the truest possible expression of grace. Number 1. The Maya skull, the face the elite built on purpose. A child of the classic Maya world might spend the first months of life with a soft board pressed to the forehead and another against the back of the head, lashed into a cradle, the bone of the skull still pliable enough to take a shape that was never natural. The goal was a long, backward-sloping forehead that continued the line of the nose in one unbroken plane, a profile you can still read on carved stelae and painted vessels across the Yucatan and the Petén. This was not a fringe practice of a single dynasty. Skeletal surveys of Maya cemeteries find shaped skulls in the clear majority of burials, across centuries and across rank, which tells you the ideal reached far below the royal court. The mechanics are simpler than they sound, and that is what makes them unsettling. An infant's cranial bones are not fused at birth. The sutures stay open. The plates float on soft tissue, and steady low pressure over the first year or two redirects how those plates grow. Bioarchaeologists generally sort the results into two broad families: the tabular forms, made by flat boards front and back, and the annular forms, made by tight circumferential wrapping. The Maya leaned heavily toward the tabular oblique style, the slanted look that pulled the whole vault up and back. The skull ends up reorganized in volume, not reduced in it, and that distinction matters more than any single image of an elongated head. For a long time, the assumption ran in one ugly direction. Early observers looked at these crania and reached for words like deformity and damage, half expecting to find broken minds behind the changed bone. The evidence refused to cooperate. Endocranial capacity in shaped skulls falls within normal human range. There is no signature of cognitive harm, no pattern of neurological injury that tracks with the practice. The brain, it turns out, accommodates the gentle redirection of a growing vault without losing tissue. What looked like mutilation to a colonial eye was closer to a slow architectural nudge, and the people doing it knew the difference between shaping a child and hurting one. The Maya did not stop at the skull. Among the elite, there is good evidence for a deliberate cultivation of crossed eyes, considered beautiful, sometimes encouraged by dangling a small bead or resin ball before an infant's face so the gaze would draw inward. The dynastic dead also carry the dental work you met earlier in this countdown: filed points and jade inlays set into the front teeth, so a single high-status face could combine a sloped forehead, an inward-turned gaze, and a mouth glinting with green stone. Read together, these were not separate fashions. They formed one coordinated grammar of status written directly into the living body, legible at a glance to anyone raised inside the code. There is a quieter detail that lingers. Cranial shaping had to begin in the cradle, decided by adults while the child was still an infant, which means the most permanent feature of a Maya person's appearance was chosen before that person could consent or even speak. The board left no pain in the adult skull and no memory in the adult mind, only a finished shape that the individual would wear into old age and into the grave. Archaeologists recover these crania centuries later and read the family's intentions off the bone, a decision frozen at the moment a parent tightened a strap. The scale is what unsettles modern readers most.
This was a mainstream society spanning city-states, monuments, mathematics, and a writing system. And a clear majority of its people walked through life with skulls that had been engineered in infancy toward a shared ideal. The practice did not mark the strange few. It marked the normal many, and the rare, unshaped skull may have been the one that stood out as odd. When the Spanish arrived and recorded their disapproval, they were describing a custom already ancient, one that had defined the Maya face for well over 1,000 years. And the strangest part is how completely it has gone quiet. The cities were swallowed by forest, the boards rotted, the practice faded under colonial pressure, and the smiling, sloped, green-toothed elite became museum bone. The skulls remain in their cases, profiles still rising in that long, clean line some parent once measured by hand, holding the shape of a beauty no living person now sees in the mirror.
Walk back through these 10, and a single thread pulls tight. In every case, the human body was treated as raw material, soft and editable, something a culture could pick up and finish according to its own idea of what a person should look like. A lip stretched around a clay disc, a skull guided into a slope, a foot folded and broken into a shape that fit inside a tiny shoe. These were not acts of cruelty for its own sake. They were acts of belonging, of beauty, of status, performed by people who loved their children and believed they were giving them an advantage in the only world they knew. That is the uncomfortable part. The deformation and the devotion came from the same hand. What unites the Mercy lip plate and the Maya cradle board and the bound feet of imperial China is not the technique, which differs wildly, but the timing. Almost all of it had to begin in childhood, in the narrow window when bone and tissue stay soft enough to be redirected. The most permanent features of these bodies were chosen by adults for children too young to refuse, which means each of these traditions was also a transfer of an idea across a generation. Parents pressing their own world onto a body that would carry it for the next 60 years. The bone simply obeyed. It is honest in a way memory is not, and it kept the record long after the cities fell and the customs went silent. That is why the skeletons in the museum cases speak so loudly. A filed tooth, a thickened earlobe channel, a rib cage narrowed by decades of lacing, a forehead rising in a deliberate line. Each one is a sentence written by a vanished society about what it valued and feared, preserved in the one material that does not lie and does not forget. We tend to think of beauty as something fleeting, a fashion that comes and goes. These people made it eternal by carving it into the only part of us that outlasts everything else. And before you decide they were stranger than us, look down at your own body. The braces, the piercings, the surgeries, the gyms, the quiet reshaping we all submit to in the name of an ideal we did not personally invent. The difference is mostly one of degree and reversibility, not of impulse. We are still the species that edits itself to fit the picture in its head.
If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, subscribe so the next one finds you.
And tell me in the comments, of all 10, which one disturbed you most, and which one do you secretly understand?